Hello and welcome. TinyPNG and TinyJPG are great free dev tools I've been using for years to compress images, but I decided to build a clone with vanilla JavaScript and a serverless function, and to my surprise, the clone provides slightly better image compression. So today I'm going to show you how to build a better TinyPNG or TinyJPG. Let's get started. I've got Visual Studio Code open, and on the left you can see I've already got some files, and that's because I'm using a foundation or a starter repository from the drag and drop tutorial I recently provided. And so I'll provide a link to that source code in the description below, but there wasn't a whole lot to it, and we don't need a whole lot to get started actually. So we'll look at the HTML first and just make a few small changes. I'll press Alt-Z to wrap the one line that I see extended beyond the screen. And you can see it links to Font Awesome right here. And then we have a link to our CSS style sheet and a link to our JavaScript. I'm going to change the title from File Input Drag and Drop to TinyPNG Clone. And after that, I'm going to change defer in the script tag to type module because we're going to use a module today, import just one class. At the same time, using type module implies defer. So defer is still applied, and that means that the body of the page will load before the script is processed. If we didn't have that there, what would happen would be, especially if you had a larger JavaScript file, the browser would stop right here and process that first and make your user wait to see the body of the page. And we don't want that. We want the user to see the body of the page as soon as possible. Okay, after that, just a few small changes here to make in the body as well. And the first thing, we're going to say up to 20 images, just like TinyPNG, but instead of no max file size, I actually discovered that Netlify, who is going to provide our serverless image, does have a max file size, and unfortunately it's 4 megs instead of 5 megs like TinyPNG. So when I say we're going to build a better TinyPNG, that's because we provide a little bit better image compression, but unfortunately one drawback is that we cannot go up to 5 megs like TinyPNG does. We can only go up to 4. Okay, I'm providing a second section here, and it has two classes, results and none. And in this section will be an unordered list, and the ID is going to be equal to results 2_ list, and the class will be equal to the same, results 2_ list. And that's really all we need for the HTML on this page. The rest will be dynamically created list items inside this unordered list. So let's save that and move on. Okay, the next change to make in the repository is simply to get rid of the README. We don't need that, so we can delete that. And now in the CSS, I don't want to focus on CSS today, but this is the CSS from the previous tutorial. I'm going to copy and paste in some more CSS that I've provided to actually look very similar to the original version of TinyPNG. I do want to highlight just a couple of areas. One, I've got a cloud background, and that's just because so does TinyPNG. But if you don't want that cloud background, you can just get rid of the background image that's on the body. It also has background size cover, and background blend mode is overlay. So it's also overlaying in some of the sky blue background color. That could all be removed, and you could just have a light and dark mode or whatever you want to do there. And then also styling the progress bar. I'll scroll down here, and there it is. So we have some of these pseudo selectors for the progress bar. There's the Mozilla progress bar pseudo selector, and that would just be for Firefox. The WebKit progress selectors here are for Chrome and for Safari. And so you might want to look at those. I'm going to provide all of this in the repository as well. Here is a finished before pseudo selector with the finished class, and this is what puts the word finished when the file is finished. And then we also have one for an error. So if we get a file error, the progress bar turns red and we see file error there. So the full repository, the completed project, will also be available in the description below. So you've got a starter repository and then the full repository, and that will have all of the CSS. I just don't want to spend time focusing on the CSS. I want to focus on the JavaScript in this tutorial and let you style your project the way you want to. Okay, the next step is to make a new folder, not inside one of these folders, but click here somewhere in the root area and then create a folder, and we'll call it image. And in there, I'm going to just put my cloud image that you'll be able to get from the repository. You could put in whatever background image you want to. So I will paste that in here. So now we've got our image folder. And now the other thing we need to do is create one more folder, and I'm going to call this dist for distribution. And this is what we're actually going to tell Netlify to build our project from. So I want to drag all of these other folders and files into the dist folder. And I'll make sure I highlight dist here so it doesn't put them inside one of the other folders. And let's get the index in there too. And now everything is in the dist folder and we're ready to start on the JavaScript. Okay, we'll click on the JavaScript folder and highlight the main.js file. We have some of our starter code in here already, and not hardly any of this will change. We could change just a little bit. Let's go ahead and look at what we've got. We've got our init app function that gets called after the DOM has loaded. So what we have here is selecting the drop area where we drop the files. Then we have an active function that just provides the green border class, and an inactive function that removes the green border class. And then we've got a prevent default function, and we could actually simplify this down to one line too. So let's go ahead and do that. And there's our prevent default that applies to these events. Now, Ahmad is a great technical editor. You might see him comment on some of our videos. Thank you, Ahmad. Anyway, what I want to say is Ahmad did a great job after the last tutorial and highlighted for me that drag enter and drag leave don't really need to have the prevent default event listeners there. So we can remove those. We've just got drag over and drop. Now, it didn't hurt to have those prevent defaults on there at all, but I just want to be accurate and go ahead and remove those. So we've got drag over and drop that get the prevents function called on them. Then we've got drag enter and drag over that need the active function, and we've got drag leave and drop that need the inactive function. So now we've got our 3 for each loops after our 3 functions are defined here. And then we have one more event listener that just goes on the drop, and it handles the dropping of the files. So we just release those files, and then this function is called into action. Now here's the init app function, and it's called when the DOM content is loaded. Now I was asked last week if that's any different from defer, and yes, defer is back in the HTML, like we said, type equals module, and that also plays a role in when the browser processes the JavaScript as far as when it's loading. So if we didn't have defer or type equals module, the JavaScript would be processed right there before it got to the body of the HTML. And even if we waited till after to call this DOM content loaded, it would stop the browser to actually evaluate the JavaScript. Now, by using defer or type equals module, it doesn't even evaluate it till after the body of the page is loaded. But this is also good practice to not call a function or anything in your JavaScript until at least the DOM content has loaded, unless you have a reason otherwise. And as I highlighted for the person that asked the question, or a couple people actually asked the question, I'm not calling init app in the global scope. Add event listener is a function, and this is a habit of mine, but I believe it's a good habit to try to not use anything in the global scope if possible. And by using add event listener, I'm not even calling that init app function in the global scope. Okay, moving on. Handle drop. This is what is called when we drop files. And just from last week's tutorial where we talked about dropping files, we got to the point where we have a file list and a file array. And we don't need to log those today, so let's get rid of both console logs. But files is our file list, and then using the spread operator, we change that into a file array, and that's what is needed right here. And then we just need to do a couple more things in this function before moving on. we'll put an if statement. We'll put if file array dot length is greater than 20, return the alert that we've got too many files. So now we've already applied our max files of 20 right there, and then we can just call handle files now that we have our file array. We'll save that, and right below this we'll define handle files. We'll accept a file array, and now inside this function we're going, scroll up a little bit, we're going to use a for each loop. So we'll have file array dot for each file. Inside the loop we'll define a file ID, and we're going to set that equal to a counter. So I'm leaving myself a note right here, and we'll move on and we'll come back to that, and then one more to increment the counter afterwards. And then we'll have another if statement. Here we'll have 3 parentheses. We'll start with file.size. That will come in from our file in the for each loop here. And then we'll divide it by 1024. And then a parenthesis. Then after that we'll divide it by 1024 one more time. Then we'll say greater than 4. And that will be the last parentheses. Now what we've done is evaluate if this is over 4 megs or not. And then if it is, we can return an alert here, and we can say file, there we go, over 4 megabytes. And we'll be finished right there then. Okay, after that we're going to call a create result function, and we'll pass in the file and the file ID. And we're also going to call an upload file function, and we'll call in the file and the file ID there as well. Now we could go back and look at the browser for just a second. So while we are calling the create result before the upload file, is we create the first half because we already have the name of the file, we already have the original file size. If I could highlight that as well. Here we go, original file size. So we already have those in place. So we create the result, and then the rest we kind of wait on until we get the results back. And we fill out the progress bar, and then we fill in the new file size and these other things. And that's the way that TinyPNG also works. So we just wanted to do something very similar to that. So we create the result, which is a list item. We upload the file, and then we go ahead and populate part of our list item result with what we get back from that. Okay, so now we need to go ahead and handle this part right here that makes our if statement look like something's wrong. So put a semicolon just to get rid of that. But what we need to do now is create our simple counter class that will get rid of anything else we've noted here that we haven't added yet. So highlight the JavaScript folder one more time and create a new file. Start with a capital C counter.js. In this new counter.js file, we'll start with export default class counter, and now we'll have a constructor. In the constructor, we'll just have one property, this underscore value equals 1. So we'll start out with a value of 1 and allow it to be incremented. And then we'll have a method called getValue, and that will just return the value. And then we'll have a second method that is called incrementValue. We won't pass in a parameter because it will always just increment by 1. And we'll say plus equals 1. And that is the complete class. Very simple. So now we can come back to the main.js, and we'll scroll to the top, click on the very first line, a couple of rows, and then we'll say import counter from, there it is, counter.js. And then we'll say const counter equals new counter. And now we have our counter that we can use. So we'll scroll back down, and where we defined our file ID, we'll just say file ID equals counter.getValue. And then on the increment line, we'll take the counter and we'll call increment value. Now we need this individual ID for each file because there's the potential for a user to drop the same file name twice, and then it wouldn't have any other individual defining characteristics because the file would be identical. So we're passing along a simple counter file ID value. Okay, we need to make create result now. So I'm going to scroll up, and instead of actually having you watch me type it out, I'm going to paste it in. And I think it would be much easier to just review this function. So we're passing in the file and file ID. Now I do call a helper function right at the beginning called getFileSizeString, and we pass in the file size. We store it right there, which would give us our original file size. But then we break it down into elements, and there's a paragraph element that has the file name, has a class of results, 2_ title, and then we have another paragraph element, and this has the file size in it, and this gets that value that we get back from the function, the original file size string, and that is the second paragraph. And then we append these two paragraphs to a div. It's the first div, and if we look in the browser, I'm breaking a list item down into 3 components. So the first component is this div right here that stops right before the progress bar, and it's just right here, so it has the title and the actual file size. That's the first div. Then we have the progress bar, and then over here, as you might guess, we have the second div that has all of this information. And now within the second div, there is a nested div, and that has the download and the percentage saved. So that is a div of its own as well. So you've got a paragraph and a div, and then in this div you've got a link and I believe another paragraph element. These are all flex boxes, and they're separated out by justifying the content to space between, just so you can see how we break those down. And then this is a progress element. Okay, back in the code, we're creating the progress bar here, and you can see it has a value of 0 to start out, and it has a max of 10, so it cannot exceed 10. It has a class name of results 2_ bar, and it gets a file ID attribute, so we can select a specific progress bar for the specific file. Here is the paragraph that has the results size, which is new size, but notice we're not populating it with any data yet because we're just creating the result. We haven't received that back from the serverless function. Then we also have a paragraph that will actually be the parent of the anchor tag that will be the download link. And then we have another paragraph that will display the results saved when we get those back and can calculate that. So then we have the inner div of that second div, and I called that div DL for download. So we append the 4th and 5th paragraphs, which are the download and the file saved size, to that div, and then it's nested within the second div, which had the paragraph that has the new file size, and then we append that div that already has the download link and the percentage saved. So that is the third component there in the list item. And then we just create this list item, and we append the first div, the progress bar, the second div. Then we append the list item to the unordered list, and we call another helper function called display results. So if you remember, this create result function started off by calling getFileSizeString. So let's define it before we define display results. So this will be const getFileSizeString equal, and it's going to accept the file size. Oh, I've got a minus sign there instead of an equal. There we go. And we'll put in file size. And it's an arrow function. We don't really need that there. Okay, so now we define the size in kilobytes. We're going to set that equal to parse float and have the file size divided by 1024. And now I have noticed on TinyPNG, this would actually match or clone TinyPNG a little bit better if we just divided by 1000. But I feel it's more accurate to use the right number, which should be 1024, to get, this would be bytes, and now we're trying to get kilobytes. Likewise, let's define a size in megabytes, and now we'll have two parentheses, parse float, file size, now one parenthesis, then divided by 1024, second parenthesis, then divided by 1024 again. And now that should give us megabytes. And TinyPNG does show megabytes when the file is large enough instead of kilobytes. So we need to be able to determine between the two. So here we're going to return the correct one by using a ternary statement. We'll say return size in kilobytes greater than 1024. And now we'll use a template literal and we'll say size in megabyte dot to fixed, and we just want one decimal point. And then we can say megabyte after that. But then if that statement over here is false, and this is how a ternary works, if the size in kilobyte is not greater than 1024, we're going to go ahead and provide the false value, and this will be the size in kilobytes instead of the size in megabytes. So we can say size in kilobyte to fixed 1, and then just provide the KB here at the end of this. Okay, let's scroll up for a little more room, and we need to define our display results. It's a very simple function, has no parameters to receive. So we define our results, which is that second section we added to our HTML that is the parent for the unordered list. It has the class results. We just use a document query selector, not query selector all, we just expect the one. And then if results.classList.contains, and we're looking for the none class that we did put on that element. So it should be there when the application loads. If it has that, we'll say results.classList.remove, and then we'll remove the none class. And we'll also say results.classList.add, and we'll add the block class, just so that section will now display results. Okay, that's the end of the create result function and its two helper functions. But if you remember back in handle files, we also then have our upload file. So let's create this function afterwards. And this is where it starts to get interesting. We're going to be uploading a file to the Netlify serverless function. So upload, and then it has a file and a file ID as well. And the first thing we'll do is define a reader, and this is going to be equal to a new file reader. And we're going to use that to read our image file that we drop. So we'll add an event listener, and here we're going to listen for the load end event. And then this will be an async function. We'll pass in the event as E here. Now inside this function we have several things to define. The first one will just be file name to make it easier. Instead of using file.name everywhere, we can just use the one-word file name. The next is base 64 string, and we are going to be converting our image to a base 64 string to send it to the function. So that is the event.target.result. And then we want the file extension of the image, and that is equal to the file name. And then we need to split, and we'll split on the period that would come before the extension. And then we'll just pop off the end, which should just be the file extension. Then we'll define the name of the file as well, and that's the file name dot slice, and it starts at 0, and we'll have file name dot length, and then we'll be minus the extension dot length plus 1. And then that should be the end of that. And then we'll have the body. And this will be the object that we're actually sending to the serverless function. So now it contains the base 64 string we've defined, it contains the name we've defined, and it contains the extension we've defined. And then we need a URL, and this is the URL for the serverless function. So it starts with ./ and then another dot, and then netlify /functions/ compress files, and that compress files is the name of our function. Okay, I'm going to scroll up for a little more room, and we'll start our try block of this function. Inside the try block, we're going to define a, I'll call it file stream, and we will await fetch, and we'll pass in the URL. And now we've got some options to define here, and the first is method, and that will be post. And then we've got body, and this will be json.stringify, and there we'll pass in the body. And then we'll have is base 64 encoded, and we'll put true. After that, we expect to get JSON back, and I'll call this image JSON. So we're going to await the file stream and call the JSON method. And now we can say if image JSON.error, then we will return a helper function that's handle file error. Now, this will be an error that we would possibly get from the server that is in Node, or the serverless function. And this is not the same as a vanilla JavaScript error that we will handle with the catch here in just a second. If we don't have an error, we'll update the progress bar with this helper function, and it will receive the file ID, and the image JSON. Okay, but now we're ready for the catch portion of this try block. And this would be a vanilla JavaScript error, and this will console error out the error right there. So this handle file error is any error information we would get back from the serverless function, which is different than an error that we would actually catch here in vanilla JavaScript, and that would bring us down here. So now we need to define handle file error and then update progress bar. Oh, I almost left out in this function, this is just the listener. Remember, we're applying a listener to the reader we defined right here. So we actually need to call it in action right here at the bottom. Reader.read as data URL, there it is, and we pass in the file, and that calls all of the above into action. Okay, I'll scroll up just a little bit, and we'll start creating the handle file error function. Remember, this is a function that handles a file error that we would receive back from the serverless function. And the very first thing we want to do is grab the progress bar, so we'll call this progress, and that will be document.getElement by ID, and then we'll put in a template literal here, and I'll put progress underscore, and then we'll put in the file name, and then we'll put another underscore, and we'll put in the file ID. And that should be all we need there. Then we'll set the progress value to 10. There we go. And then we'll go progress.classList.add, and we'll add the error class, so it turns the progress bar red and puts the text over it, file error. And that's the end of that function. And now we need to create the update progress bar function. And this receives the file ID, and the JSON that we get back from the serverless function. Once again, we need the progress bar, so I'll just grab it like we did up in the previous function. And we'll come down here and define add progress. We're going to do that with a set interval. There's no real way to get step-by-step or play-by-play information back from fetch or the serverless function. So the progress bar is a little bit more for show than it is actually based on the progress, which is oftentimes the case in different applications and on websites. So it does make it look good, I guess. So we'll go ahead and increment it with this set interval. So we'll have progress.value, or not equals, we'll do a plus equals 1, so it takes the value and adds 1 to it each time the interval fires. Then we'll say if progress.value equals 10, that's where we're ready to stop. So we'll clear the interval, and here we just have to name the interval, so that is add progress. That clears that out, and then we'll go progress.classlist.add, and we'll add the finished class, there we go, can't talk. And that will add the word finished over the progress bar. And then we'll call populate result. And so this will populate the rest of the list item that we've already created when we called create result. And we pass in the file ID, and the image JSON. The other thing we need before we finish is to set the interval for this set interval function, and we just set that to 50 milliseconds, which makes it a fairly smooth progress bar. Okay, scrolling up for some more room now, we clearly need to create the populate result function, and I'll just paste that in much like we did with the create result. So let's break this down. We're receiving the file ID, and the JSON as parameters. The new file size string calls getFileSizeString, which we already previously defined when we created the result and we were presenting the original file size. So this is calling a function we already have. The %saved value calls a getPercentSaved function, which we'll need to create. The new size is the new file size, and it is just set equal to that new file size string. Then we grab the download paragraph, and that's saved as this download variable here. And then we go ahead and call create download link and pass in the JSON, and that will create the anchor tag we need to download the new image with the new file size. It has the same name. And then we append the link to that download paragraph. And then we create a saved variable, and we grab the area that we want to put the %saved. And here we put the %saved in by calling the math object and the round method of the math object, just to get a whole number instead of a lot of decimal points. Okay, so we need to define at least two functions that we don't have yet: get %saved and create download link. Scrolling up just a little bit more, we'll start with get %saved. So we'll have const get %saved, there it is. And this will accept the original file size, and it's also going to accept the new file size. And now here we'll define original fs equal to parse float original file size, and we'll do the same thing for the new file size. So we'll have new fs equals parse float, and we'll put in the new file size. And then we're just going to return two parentheses original file size minus new file size, and then after one closing parentheses we'll go divided by original file size. And then we have it times 100 to get our percentage, and that's the complete function. So we'll save that, come down just a little bit, and create this create download link function, and it just receives the JSON. And now we'll define extension, and this is much like we defined the extension earlier in a function, but now we pass in the image JSON and get the file name out of it. And then we call split. We split on the period that should separate the file extension, and we pop off the file extension at the end. We'll define the link, and this is going to be equal to document.createElement. We create an anchor tag, and then the link href attribute is going to be equal to, and now this is something directly related to base 64 images. or our base 64 string. So it starts off with some metadata here, data, image, then slash. We'll pass in the extension, and after the extension we have a semicolon, and then base 64, comma, and then we say image JSON dot base 64 comp string, and that is a name that we are defining in the serverless function, and it is coming back to us. So you'll see that again when we create the serverless function. The link download attribute, and that has the file name, what you want the file to be called when it's downloaded. We get that from the JSON as well. And the link.text content, and that should always say download, as we see a download link for each image in the results. And then we just return the link. We save that, and that is what is called up here, and it's appended back to this download paragraph area. And that is the end of the vanilla JavaScript. Okay, to create the serverless function, we're going to make sure you have Node installed. So go back to the browser and then go to nodejs.org. If you don't have Node, it is just JavaScript. It is a little different, but don't get freaked out. It's not going to be any more complicated than what you've been doing. So download the current version of Node. And from there, we'll come back to Visual Studio Code. Let's open a terminal window. You can do that by going to Terminal, New Window, or pressing Control plus Shift plus the backtick. So we've opened our new terminal window. And in this terminal window, you want to check your version of Node after you have it installed. And you can go Node-V, and it tells you what version you have. And if you've completed that much, now we need to install the Netlify CLI. This won't be a dependency for our project. It's just a tool we will use. And to do that, let's go back to the browser quickly, and you want to go to npmjs.com, and there you can search for packages and search for Netlify-CLI. You can find this package. And here's the install command. However, they don't have a -G afterwards, which I do suggest, and that means global. I already have this installed, but I'll type the command out for you. And we want to be here in the terminal and type npm I for install, then netlify-cli-g. And once you start this, it will take a little bit of time to install, so pause the video and come back once you have that complete. Okay, you've got Node installed, you've got the Netlify CLI installed, and now we're ready to initialize npm, which comes with Node, and that stands for Node Package Manager. And we will have some dependencies for this project. So we're going to start with npm init, and then -y will keep it from asking you a bunch of questions when it first starts. So go ahead and enter that, and this will take just a second, but not long. And now you can see we've got a package JSON file, and it has some details about the project name, TinyPNG Clone, the version, not much else, but this will list the dependencies once we begin to add those. So let's go ahead and add those. And we'll do that much like we installed the Netlify CLI, but we can name them all in one list if we want to. So we'll go npm I, and then space, and we'll start naming dependencies. The first one is image min, and the next one is image min -jpeg -recompress, and then the last one is image min -png quant, Q-U-A-N-T, and we'll press enter, and it'll take just a little bit to install these. All right, when those are finished installing, you should have seen a lot of things go by in your terminal window. But you should also have success messages and little check marks as they've tested the build and so on. And here you can see where it tells you the version of each that you have installed. But you'll also see that, as I pull this down, inside your package JSON, under dependencies, you now have those different packages listed as well. So that, with that complete, now back over here in your file tree, create a new file. One thing you want to do when you're using Node modules is create a git ignore file, and it starts with dot. And inside this, we'll put node_modules. You don't want to load up your Node modules folder to GitHub. That just takes up a lot of space, and there's no reason for that. So now we have our gitignore that has node modules in it. We also need to create a netlify toml file. So let's go ahead and create one more file here in the root, and it's netlify.toml. Inside the netlify toml file, there isn't much, but we start with build in brackets, and then on the next line we can tab over and type publish, and we're telling netlify what directory to publish, and that is our dist folder. And then we'll come down a couple of lines and we'll say functions equals, and we're telling netlify where our functions will be. And I'm going to create a folder named serverless. So let's save our file. And that's all we need in this netlify toml file. So now let's close out everything we have open over here. And you can see we've got our dist folder, that's what netlify will publish. We've got node modules that we pulled in packages from, but we will not send that to GitHub. We've created a gitignore file, a netlify toml file, and we have our package JSON. So the only thing we're missing now is our folder in the root that is named serverless. Now with our serverless folder, we want to go ahead and create a JavaScript file inside of it called compressfiles.js. This is the file that will have our serverless function, and if you remember back in our function in our main.js file inside of our vanilla JavaScript, we actually listed off where this would be in the URL, and we said compress files. Now everything else netlify requires here, it requires that you use functions here, not the name we call our folder, and then you tell netlify in the toml file what you've named your functions folder. So we named it serverless. But you must use an address like this, and then at the very end, you need to name the file or folder that is your function. And so that's what we've got. So we will come back to compress files, and we'll begin making our serverless function. We'll start by requiring our node packages we brought in. So const image min equals require image min. And then const image min JPEG with a capital J, and then recompress. So we're using camel case here, capital J and R, equals require parentheses. Now we say image min dash JPEG dash recompress. And then we do the last one as well, image min, and then it's capital PNG quant. And that's going to equal require quote, and here it is in our list. And put the semicolon there. Now we've required all of our node packages, and we start our serverless function, and all serverless functions start like this, as exports.handler equals async. And now we have an event and a context for the function as parameters. And now the first thing I'm going to do is define params, and this is going to equal json.parse, and this is the event body. Now if you remember, we sent an object to the serverless function, and it had three different properties in the object, or three different values. And here we can deconstruct this object and pull those out. We had the base 64 string, that is our image encoded into base 64. We had the name of the file, and we had the extension. And this is going to equal our params. So we just deconstructed those. And then here we'll define base 64 image is going to equal our base 64 string dot split, and then we split on some of the metadata in there that says base 64, so you don't want that as part of the image. And then we'll pop the rest of that off that comes after the base 64. Okay, then the file name, and this is equal to a template literal. We'll have name, and then after the name, as you would expect, there's a dot, and then we have the extension. Okay, now we've defined some of the things we need to start out with. So let's start our try block. And inside the try block, we're going to define a result. And this is going to equal a buffer that we create from our base 64 image that we just got. And we'll let the buffer know that it's base 64. So we've pulled in the base 64 string, and then we split out some of the metadata, so we just had the image data here. So we could have called this base 64 image data, but I just called it base 64 image. And now we're using that base 64 data to create a buffer, and that is held in result. Notice we're not writing to the file system. We're not creating any files in the serverless image. So we're going from base 64 string to buffer. So we'll name this new image buffer. And this is what we'll get back because ImageMin can compress an image that is a buffer. So we have ImageMin.buffer. We pass in the result that we have. And now there's some options for ImageMin. And we first have to have a destination of where this will go. This goes in serverless /compress_files. If you don't provide a destination, even though we're not writing the file anywhere inside or on the server, if you don't provide that, ImageMin won't work. So we needed that destination. After that, we have plugins, and these are the libraries or the other packages that we installed, and they're used to compress. So we have ImageMin, JPG, recompress, and you can look each one of these up on npmjs.com and get the specifics for their readmes and their documentation. But here this says you can go min 20, and max will set it to 60. And this is saying the quality of the image or how aggressively you want to compress the image file. Now the next one is ImageMin PNG quant. There we go. And this accepts a little bit different parameters, but it's saying the same thing. Quality, now in brackets, 0.2, 0.6. And now that we've got both of those, we'll go ahead and put a semicolon there, and now we have a new image buffer. And this new image buffer is the compressed image. It's just still a buffer. And we're going to use that before we're finished here in the try block. So we need the new file size. So we'll say file size is equal to, and with a buffer, it's easy to get the file size. We'll just say new image buffer dot length, and that is the file size in bytes. Now we'll have a base 64 comp string. So we need to convert this buffer back to base 64. So we'll have new image buffer dot toString, and then we tell it base 64. And now we need to create an object to send back to our vanilla JavaScript, image data object equals, and here we put in our base 64 comp string that we've already created. We'll put in the full file name, and we'll put in the file size. And now we're ready to return data. I'll scroll up for a little bit more room. We don't need much. We're going to say return, and inside the return we want to pass a status code of 200, and then a body. And here we'll use json.stringify once again, and we'll pass in the image data object. Then we'll complete our try block with the catch, and we'll catch the error. And inside the catch, we'll just return a status code of 500 that indicates a server error. And then we'll have a body that will have some JSON of its own here, so we can do this with an error. And inside the JSON, we'll just say file error. And you know what? We should probably use JSON stringify here as well. So we'll stringify this. And that should go back. In case there's a server error, we will trigger our handle file error in the vanilla JavaScript. Okay, we're almost ready to test out our function. Just a couple of quick errors for me to clean up, and I'm sure I'm going to highlight or annotate those before for you in this tutorial, but we'll go back and fix those now. And one is on line 131. I didn't put a const in front of defining the image JSON, so it was undefined. And then on line 149, I referred to file name, but we passed in the file, so we actually need file.name here on line 149. We can save those changes and we should be good to go. Now you've installed the Netlify CLI already. We don't have to even have the site hosted on Netlify at this point. We can use the tool. So we'll have Netlify space dev, and this will launch our project on a local server, usually at port 8888. So I'll go ahead and press enter, and you just wait a second and it will open the browser for us and show us the project. And here's the project. I'll go ahead and open DevTools so we can see if we get any other errors. And the only error we have is not having a fave icon, I believe. Yeah, that's what it's looking for, the fave icon. And you can install one of those for your site if you want to. But right now, I'm going to drag an image over and we'll see how it goes. Drug in the thumbnail for this video. And now we've got, it started out at 630 kilobytes and it's now 329.5 kilobytes, minus 48%. In comparison, let's go ahead and reload TinyJPG, and I'll drag the same image over to it. And this is 645. Takes just a little bit on the web. Ours will too. If we host it on Netlify, it will take just a little longer. It's minus 27% and now 469 kilobytes. We saved a little bit more in our version. Here we go. Ours is 329 and the image still looks great. I can vouch for that. So that is good. Let's go ahead and try a few images all at once and see how it goes. I'll grab 5 images, drag them all over and drop, and we'll see what happens. It's working well, so we can download any of these. Let me go ahead and show in the folder, and it pulled up on my other monitor. But I'll open the image and I can drag it over. Image still looks great, so the compression isn't hurting the image whatsoever. That's a good picture of a flower. So there you have it, a TinyPNG or TinyJPG clone that will compress your images as good or even better than the original. And from here, all I'm leaving up to you is to create a button that will download all of the images at once, like TinyPNG or TinyJPG does. And then you could also load this up to Netlify, because remember, right now we had this in the dev environment, but I have a continuous deployment tutorial already that will show you how to create a GitHub repository. You push your repository to GitHub, and then with your free Netlify account, you can link those, and every time you push to GitHub, your project will deploy. And that's what you want to do with this. I've already tested it out, and it works great on the web as well. Have a great week. Thank you for watching. I appreciate the support. Please give the video a like if you found it helpful, and thank you for subscribing as well. I'll see you next time.